Welcome to the Nonprofit Edge, a podcast series to promote purpose in practice. Each week, this webinar series features an extraordinary individual that provides valuable and impactful services, helping to transform the capabilities of their nonprofit clients. Join us as we explore a variety of topics, all vital to the success of nonprofit organizations. Learn and grow from the experience and expertise of our featured guests. Without further delay, let's introduce you to the host of the Nonprofit Edge podcast series, Chris Looney.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Nonprofit Edge, where we explore the leadership ideas, strategies, and emerging trends shaping the future of the nonprofit sector. Today, we're discussing a topic that many leaders are curious about, some are cautious about, and almost everyone is trying to better understand, and that's artificial intelligence. AI is already influencing how organizations operate, how donors engage with information, and how decisions are made. Yet many nonprofit leaders are still trying to determine where AI belongs within their organization and how to adopt it responsibly. Our guest today believes the real danger isn't AI itself. The real danger is adopting it without a clear ethical framework or waiting so long that you're forced into reactive decisions. Joining us is Tara Quarrie, President and CEO of Quarrie Development Group, an AI implementation and advisory firm serving the nonprofit sector. Tara is a veteran fundraiser who has secured multiple 7- and 8-figure gifts and is the creator of the Trust Framework, the only AI ethics methodology developed by a fundraiser specifically for fundraising organizations. She's also a Google AI certified advisor and works with organizations on responsible AI adoption. Tara, welcome to the Nonprofit Edge.
Thank you, Chris. I'm so happy to be here. I think there's a lot of benefit from this podcast that a lot of people in our sector can use. I'm just happy to be a part of the conversation.
Well, we're happy to have you with us, and I'm excited to learn along with our listeners because you are on the forefront of AI as it impacts the nonprofit sector and fundraising specifically. So let's jump in. And
Sure.
I know many nonprofit leaders still think they're evaluating whether AI belongs in their organization. Why do you believe that conversation is already behind us?
I would start with the numbers. There is a 2026 study that has been shown to say that 92% of us are already using AI in some form or capacity. So I think the conversation has really moved from should we to do we know it's already happening? Most leaders are managing a system that they simply haven't audited. I think there's a lot of people that are at the stage where they're asking themselves, should we adopt AI? And really all the numbers and all the data say that it's really, we already did, but nobody's looking at it. That's really the stage you're at. It's kind of like discovering your teenager already has a car. You're not asking, oh my gosh, are they driving? The question is now, okay, well, did anybody teach them the rules of the road? How are they going to drive? So I think a lot of people just underestimate the fact that the question of evaluation has really passed, and we're now deep in the throes of evaluating how it's going to affect the relative sector that we're in, nonprofit sector being the one that we're in particular.
Good, good. I like your analogy of the car because I thought you were going to go the birds and the bees conversation where the teenager has already figured that out, whether or not you've had the conversation with them, right? So when you kind of talk about how donors are already being targeted by AI, what does that look like in practical terms?
Sure. So the donor management platforms that exist right now all run on predictive scoring. They predictive score on every record. It could be likelihood to give, it could be likelihood to lapse, it could be suggested ask amount. And the problem is that all of that is happening usually completely invisible to the gift officer. So the donor experiences it as personalization, but they've never consented to it. So if an outreach is triggered, you're using AI and an outreach is triggered that is just thinking of you note. Um, the donor's going to feel warm. They're going to feel seen. They're going to feel personalized, really.
Mm,
When the actual matter of fact thing is that it was triggered by a score crossing a threshold. So the origin of that just thinking of you message comes from a dashboard. And I think we can all agree that if a donor is being made to feel a certain kind of emotion that is falsified, that is dishonest, at the very worst. And I think for us in the nonprofit sector, I think we have to go much further beyond, is this legal? And our bar is not, is this legal? We are a human-centered sector. We need to really think more about how is this going to affect the people and the donors that make up the work that we do.
yeah, that's great. And how is AI already shaping donor behavior, donor expectations, and donor decision making?
It is, I mean, it's in every experience now. You think about everything that is targeted towards us, whether it be ads on our social media, whether it be banking apps, whether it be streaming. You turn on Netflix and everybody's streaming looks different depending on what they're watching. Personalization is essentially the baseline now, and it's interesting because the nonprofit sector is kind of split between donors that say AI would have either a positive or neutral effect on their giving, or the ones that say it would make them less likely to give. And it's interesting because I think the split shows more how AI is working and not really whether it's working. Everybody has an opinion as a donor how AI is going to affect the way they give. It's not whether AI is being used. Most of them have an opinion. The bar has moved because of the level of personalization that is required for most for-profit companies to make a sale, at the end of the day. And most people don't opt in. I know there's a lot of laws being made for opt in, opt out, but I think all of us know, how often do you see something that asks you to opt in or opt out? You don't even read it. You just want to get to the next thing. You want to get to the show you're watching. You want to get to the decision you're going to make. You want to get to what you're going to buy. And I think that bar has moved, not, before AI even happened. And now AI is just operating in that sphere.
Got it. Got it. Um, what misconceptions do nonprofit leaders have about AI today?
I, in my work, I've seen that there's really two camps. Um, there's one side that says, out of fear, AI is going to replace my major gifts officers team. And the other camp is saying, we're too small, AI doesn't really matter for us. We're all about relationships. It just doesn't apply. And the reality check is that, like, neither of those camps is completely correct. The fact of the matter is nonprofits are using AI. It's just that a lot of times what it looks like is, let's say you have a team of 4 development staff. 4 different people on your development team have either Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT, all individual accounts, and they're taking data that they think can help them create a better outreach letter or marketing campaign. They're putting your organization's data into their private chatbot or LLM, and there's just simply no governance. They are using it though, and I think the idea of like AI adoption right now is really just one person using it very quietly, and there's just no oversight of how it's being used. Now that's not me saying that you should go in and say, who's using AI? Okay, stop using it. Obviously, that is not the answer. That is just going to push things even further deeply down. And when issues do arise, your development staff is going to probably be even more afraid to share that with you because you banned it. Um,
Mm,
you know, it's there's kind of this idea to name like the efficiency plateau. There's a lot of nonprofits using AI, but a very small percentage are really reporting any significant improvements or capability. And that's just because most orgs aren't allowing AI to transform their workflow. They're just using it to get emails out faster, to proofread letters faster, to get marketing emails out faster. There is a system that you have to do with AI to implement it into your organization's workflow to create any kind of capacity increase. And I think those two camps of people decide, the ones saying it's going to replace my gift officers and it's not for us, are not realizing that it is very much about both of those camps. They both have the same gaps that they're not seeing about how AI is already embedded into probably a lot more workflows than they even think.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. Um, well, for those that are not sort of currently paying close attention to AI, those leaders, what are the risks they're potentially missing that you've surfaced and come across?
I think one of the major risks is having no governance policy at all, no AI governance policy. Um, Nearly half the sector has zero guardrails on tools that are already touching donor data. I did a presentation to a group of about 60 nonprofit leaders about a week ago, varying levels of seniority in a different affiliates of a development organization, a national organization. And I asked the question, who's using AI? And almost every single hand went up. And then when I asked who's actually following a policy that their CEO or CDO implemented, I mean, nobody raised their hands, but the looks on the faces of the actual CEOs and CDOs who were in the rooms, that was concerning because they were the ones that realized, oh, that's on me. That's a risk that this is a big risk that I'm taking. I just saw half my development staff raise their hand and they literally said to this person, nobody's given us any guardrails. We're just kind of going by the seat of our pants, really. So I think that's the biggest risk is just not taking the time to one admit and that AI is a part of very likely a part of your development workflow, and realizing that no policy at all leaves you open for so many disasters to happen. And it's not like a disaster in the for-profit world where they can say, oops, that was just AI, sorry. If a mistake happens for you and for a development professional, that's money lost forever. A donor may never give to you again if something goes wrong because you didn't have a governance policy for AI. So, it is affecting for-profit and nonprofit world as we can see, but I think the risks are much higher for our sector because of what we often say, we are so based on trust and the human aspect of it and the relationship aspect of it. So I think that's my number one risk is just not having a policy at all.
Yeah, no, it's a good cautionary tale. I mean, it seems like it's an own goal scenario,
Mhm.
totally avoidable, preventable stuff. So
Completely.
dangerous, but
I always say to
preventable.
people, it's nothing is wrong with using AI in the nonprofit sector. It's that you don't tell anybody that you're doing it. And it is so easy to just slide in a simple sentence, you know, we are using AI to respond faster to you. Don't worry, all of us look at the what goes out before it actually goes out to you. Something so simple, just so that nobody can come back and say, well, I didn't know that personalized letter or email didn't come from Susie Smith, gift officer. It's so avoidable, like you said. It really is.
Yeah, great. Great. Thank you for that. So let's move from awareness to responsibility because
Sure.
that's where your work really focuses. And you've said the greatest risk isn't adopting AI, it's adopting it without the framework. So let's continue to talk about that. What are the perils of having or using AI without a framework?
Um, I think first, for some reason, a lot of organizations tend to think that a framework is going to slow things down. It's going to take too much time to put together. It's going to be too many steps to follow. It's just going to slow the whole procedure down. And that is not real. It is there so that when something does go well, you have record of it and you can go back and see that it worked and you can repeat it. Now, on the same hand, when something does go wrong, you can trace it back to its original error and say, oof, okay, good thing this framework caught this because now we can make sure this doesn't happen again. So I don't quite understand. I think there needs to just be more education into thinking that creating a framework is too much work. It's really just a one and done deal. You create it at the beginning, that's your framework. And of course, as time goes on, you're going to make changes based on changing priorities or technology or, sector-wide initiatives. Yes, but the time it takes to put together a framework for your organization around AI will save you so many mistakes and will probably uncover a lot of things that you can continue to do on repeat that will push you further and increase your capacity. So I think it sounds like a lot of homework. It sounds technical, but and I think that's just because, ethics makes us think of like compliance and legal language, governance, and it's not that. It's really just, it's not a CEO on a board conversation. It's not an IT policy. Yes, those are boring and those can get kind of dicey. It is, I would tell people if you're struggling to think of ethics in a human way, remember the sector you're in. Everything we do is human. Everything we do is relational. Even the frameworks that I think we need to be creating around AI policies for our organizations.
Right. And at this point, there's probably several available samples that can be
Tons.
adopted. It doesn't mean that you have to create this from whole cloth. You can stitch it together from multiple
Mhm.
sources, other
Mhm.
organizations that you respect in your sector, probably even using AI to source some decent,
Yeah. Or even
helpful.
asking the team that you have at your on your staff. They've, like I said, a lot of them have been using AI for at least several months now, if not a year or so. Maybe you could start the framework by asking questions to your staff. Where did this help you? Where did you find that you made mistakes? What do you want to make sure something that you're doing? What do you want to make sure everybody on the staff is doing? Or what do you want to make sure everybody on the staff is not doing? That's a simple place to start in addition to all the examples that you gave.
Great. Well, how should nonprofit leaders think differently about AI than their counterparts in the for-profit sector?
Ooh, I'll start with what I usually say about the history of nonprofits. Um, I think we all know as a sector that we have not changed structurally much at all in the 100 years that the sector has been around. And I think we can also all agree, for better or for worse, that historically we have not been the quickest to respond to technological change. We were last to CRM use. We were last to online giving. We were last to email. I mean, there's just been a lot of shifts in technology that I think we can all agree on as a sector. We just took a really long time to adopt. And when we finally did, the measurement of success it brought us was pretty considerably diminished by the amount of time it took us to get there. Now, part of the reason I'm on the mission I am is because I think this technological shift is not something we can afford to get left behind in.
Very
So
good.
I'm gonna frame that's my framing of it. Now, on the other hand, think about the technological changes that for-profits made as things came on in the last, however, 20, 30, 40 years, and how things changed positively for them. Okay. Increased sales, increased customers. Sales for us is just donor dollars. Customers for us are volunteers or donors. So that's something we can do similar to for profit. On the other hand, there are a lot of things that I think we need to do differently. And that is because for profits are optimizing the transaction, whereas nonprofits, we're dealing more with trust as capital. The relationship itself is the asset, essentially. Um,
Nice.
I kind of made this example earlier, but if a for-profit or, if a retail brand uses AI and makes a offensive or kind of messy ad, all they do to recover is say, oops, sorry, our AI, it wasn't us, it was AI.
Mm,
As a nonprofit, we don't have that luxury. Our whole model assumes that the donor believes that their gift and their relationship with the organization they're giving to has intention behind it. If we make a mistake with a donor, that donor may never give to the organization again. That donor may go on social media and say how we treated them and how we disobeyed their trust. That can be a ripple effect. I mean, we cannot recover from things like that the same way for-profit does. We simply
yeah.
cannot. And so I think that's a big thing that we need to realize, that there are things that we can take from the for-profit sector on how we should be thinking differently, but there are also some ways that we need to really think very unique to our sector, because we are different. Our currency is different, our output is different. It is not just dollars, it is lives affected and lives changed.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's perfect. And you kind of shared a little bit of the concern about what can happen when donor trust is broken um, through this sort of use of AI. What I would be interested in knowing, and I know our nonprofit leaders out there are going to be interested in knowing, is the sort of ethical lines that nonprofit leaders should be careful not to cross. What are those in your mind? How can
Hmm.
you, what insight can you give there when it comes to sort of ethical behaviors?
I think something to always keep in mind and to write down on your phone, your desk, whatever, is that AI should never, ever make the final call on anything that has to do with donor intent. How a gift is honored, how a tribute or memorial is worded. Um, sometimes as donors, we find out about things that happen to a donor that are very close and personal: a death, a divorce, another major life event that creates vulnerability, intense personal emotions. Those are moments that donors are always going to remember. We've heard stories at various galas before from uh 8, 9 figure donor who says, I remember the one word that a major gift officer made to me 10 years ago, and I knew then that I was going to leave them in my estate. There needs to be a human decision behind those kinds of decisions. Not just a human edit, but an actual human decision, beyond just AI. And I think that is one of the most important ethical lines that we cannot afford to cross.
Hmm. Hmm. That's great.
It's transparency with donors is something that I think we're not really proactive about.
Keep
I
going. Yeah,
think
keep going.
there is, it's the credibility is a signal. It's not a liability. It's a simple line that you include. I said this earlier. Just say, we are a 3-person development staff trying to increase our budget by $1 million. The only way we can do that is if we respond to all of you incredible people out there faster. We can only do that faster with AI. However, if you are reading this message, somebody's eyes did look at the message before it was press send. So yes, there was AI involved because, at the end of the day, AI is superior to humans in doing things at scale. Govern data, little like workarounds that are just, they take a lot of time. AI is excellent for that. That doesn't mean that it should be the only way that it's going out. Every message should be reviewed. And it's so simple just to let your donors know that you're doing that. The reality is, so many people are using AI, it is starting to be less and less likely that a donor will find out that their nonprofit that they support is using AI and say, oh, I can't believe that. How could they? I mean, that donor is probably using AI to make the millions of dollars that they give to donate to your
Ah,
organization anyway. I mean,
right,
that's just matter
right,
of fact. There really is. I could go on a whole nother tangent about the power dynamics of donors or foundations saying that smaller nonprofits should not be using AI.
right,
That's a
right.
topic for
Wait,
another time.
wag your finger at us
Yeah,
while you're doing it,
exactly.
yourself. Yeah, 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 of course.
Exactly. So I
Yeah.
think just being a little bit more reactive in disclosing your use instead of somebody having to ask you, hey, did AI write this? Did a chatbot write this? It just does the opposite. You don't have to deal with that if you're reactive to it.
Yeah, and transparent.
And
Yeah,
transparent. Exactly.
very good. Um, so you do believe that donors care whether AI is being used.
The numbers are split. It is almost equal number of donors that say AI will make me give more or I don't really care versus the number of donors that are saying it makes me feel yucky or gross or I wouldn't give. Um, I think that the deciding factor in the more qualitative research is almost always about disclosure and intent, which we just talked about. It's not really the existence of the tool, it's just that they want to know how it's going to be used.
Okay.
It is something that is going to make things easier and more efficient. It doesn't mean that people want to just be led astray by it. If you're not going to be upset that your doctor uses an MRI. But if your doctor came to you and said, "Oh, I personally read every single scan and this is what I think." What if you found out they were making that up? You would be livid. Your health is at risk now. So
Right.
there is value in the technology, but it's about how you say you're using it that I think is matters to the transparency that you mentioned and the overall disclosure.
Yep. So let's move into the trust framework,
Mhm.
which you created, and I would love for you to share a little bit about what the trust framework is, and then we can build off of that.
Sure. So I built the trust framework because I felt that we needed some decision-making tools as opposed to just like, this is what we value as an organization using AI. It is something that I felt we needed created by someone like myself that has experience as a development professional, not just a vendor pitching a tool, so to speak. So the 5 pillars that I created for trust, they're questions that I think a leadership team should be able to answer about any AI tool they use before it even gets involved in their workflow. So T in trust is transparency. That question is around, would we be comfortable if a donor saw exactly how we were using this? The R is respect for consent. And that question is around, did anyone agree to have their data used in this way? That's the respect for consent. The U, unintended consequences. The question that we would ask is, who could this quietly take advantage of? Unfortunately, that is a big factor that's affecting how we're using AI.
Hmm.
The S, staff and stakeholder voice. That question is around, did the people closest to the work, the program officers, the grant writer, the major gift officer, did they have a say before any of this AI governance was deployed? Were they asked questions about the work they do? Are all stakeholders that are going to be using AI in this organization appropriately represented? And the last T is the human in the loop, which I think a lot of people know whether they say it out loud or not, but it's, who's accountable if this goes wrong? And when exactly does that person who's going to be held accountable, where exactly do they step in? So again, it's intended to be a framework related to questions that we should be asking ourselves before we start using whatever million of AI tools that we want to use in our development workflow.
It's perfect. It's wonderful. And
Thank
thank you
you.
for developing it.
Yeah.
Um, how can nonprofit executives use the framework as a decision-making tool rather than simply an ethics checklist?
hmm I think a checklist is more retrospective. Did we do this when we started? Whereas using it as a decision-making tool is before the case, asking ourselves, given who we serve, what is the correct step here in our organization? I designed this framework to be used and to be run well in advance of purchasing a tool, an AI tool, of rolling out a governance policy, rolling out whatever decisions you want to have around your staff using AI. You don't want to just bolt it on afterwards. You don't want to make all this governance policy and have all these decision-making frameworks and then say, oh yeah, this is the trust framework. Did we do this? That it's completely backwards. You need to be using it before and in order to create and design a framework that works individually and uniquely for your organization, for the personalities of your staff, and for the concern of your unique donors. And I think that's kind of anything with, I think I said this earlier, but ethics makes us think really legal and educational. And really, if we think about it more as just proper decision making, I think it takes away the roughness of the word, and makes it a little bit less intimidating, less scary, kind of. If you think about something that you want to just make sure that you're not hurting those around you, I think it makes it a lot easier to think of making the decision before you roll out any significant tool.
Yeah. Well, and I do love the concept of process protects. It can be part of a process,
hmm
um, and in that way, it protects. You said, those you love, but those you're responsible for, those
Exactly.
that are under your care and supervision, et cetera, et cetera. So I like anything that is a process-oriented thing that helps protect
hmm
the safety of those around you and those that you're responsible for.
Yeah, and I
Wondering if
think,
you, go
as
ahead.
a development professional, we have a very different view of using AI than maybe a tech vendor does. I think there's been some fantastic tech created around AI for our sector, but a lot of them have not had to ask an individual for a seven-figure gift. A lot of them have not had to look a donor in the face when they've made a mistake and that gift is on the line. Having that context, I think, is something valuable in this framework, as opposed to something that has maybe been developed by people who want to support nonprofits. I absolutely believe that's true for a lot of tech organizations that are building tools for our sector. But making decisions for AI based on your knowledge, and in this case, my knowledge of how donors have reacted to, any shift in the past, I think is really important.
But what are the first questions a CEO should ask before approving an AI initiative?
Some questions. What data is this tool being trained on or pulling from is, I think, a number one question, especially as it relates to information we find on how to identify or move donors through a pipeline. Another question, who's accountable if it's wrong? And what is the fix if it's wrong? Another question, if a donor saw exactly how this worked, would they feel respected or would they feel offended and surprised? I think those questions, they're not really technical questions, which is ironic considering they're questions about AI, but they are, funny enough, more human-centered questions, which I think is a trademark of our sector and how we should be asking questions. We are using technology as we use AI, but I don't think we need to be asking the same tech questions because we are not tech firms. We are human-centered firms. We are nonprofit sector that does arguably some of the most important work in this country, and so I think the questions don't need to be technical, even though it's about tech.
That's great. I want to move in our last segment to fundraising in an AI-enabled world.
Mhm.
And you've spent your career building donor relationships. How do you think AI is going to change fundraising over the next 5 years?
Yeah. It's funny. I started off when I started this company and started studying how AI was going to affect our sector. I used to always say, AI is going to free you up so that you can do more of the relational work. And I start seeing that a lot everywhere. I try really hard not to say that anymore because I think what AI is doing and how I want to start framing it is that it's changing what's possible for under-resourced teams. You're kind of changing the standard that donors expect. You're not just time swapping. If AI gives you 5 hours of your time back, are you really better off if now you just fill that 5 hours with more burnout causing activities? No. It should allow you to do the work you were doing better and spend more time on it because you got that time back, not just filling it in. And I don't think that's a knock on nonprofits. I think all of us, human nature in this day and age, when we get time back, we don't just sit down and relax and, have some tea. We're like, oh my gosh, what else can I do now? I just got 5 hours back. I mean, it's insanity. But I think the shift will be, I don't think it's going to really be time allocation. I think it's going to be, we all know the majority of nonprofits in this country are extremely under-resourced, most under $500,000. So I think we're going to see these small development shops having access to research that they could never access, segmentation that they never had access to, analysis capacity that used to require tens of thousands of dollars hiring an entire department to figure out, there's already, I think, something like 30% of nonprofits that have reported increased fundraising revenue in just the past year, just the past year of adopting AI tools. And, it's happening, it is actually increasing our fundraising capacity. So I think I have really high hopes. There's all this talk of how much money is going to be made through AI. And I think of it as, why does it have to just be for-profit sectors using AI that are getting richer? Why does it have to be the billionaire that started an AI company making more money? Why can't we as a sector use AI to increase the amount of funding that comes to us? It's not going to come in the form of profits, no, but if every nonprofit could increase their fundraising by even 5%, I mean, I'm not a math genius, but money back into our sector. A lot more people would be helped. And that would be a fraction of the money that's going to be made by people outside of the nonprofit sector. So I think it has the potential to really, really change not only the funding that is going to come into our organization, but there's going to be a lot of people that made a lot of money very quickly and are at a very different type of generation, and giving personality than we've had in the past. And I think for us as nonprofits, understanding the tools and the capacity increases that it can create for individuals and nonprofit organizations alike will give us a way to communicate with the new owners of wealth in how it flows into the development workflow and workforce. So I think it's going to change not only fundraising in and of itself, the actual act and tool of fundraising, but I think the dollars that we're going to be going after, the way we do that, and the capacity and intensity at which we do that is going to change significantly over the next 5 years as well.
Mm. Well, it's exciting to think about the possibility of a more level playing ground
Mhm.
between the sort of wealthy, capably budgeted institutions and some of those smaller shops that now have access to the same information for next to nothing in terms of cost. So we know how important information is
Yes.
to fundraising. So it's wonderful to know that there's more access to critically needed information. So that's great. Are there parts of fundraising that just should never be automated?
I think there are varying uh, answers to that depending on who you ask, especially as it relates to the emergence of virtual engagement officers. Um, in
Which I've
my
started to
opinion,
see on
yes,
staff rosters, even on
yes.
websites.
Personally, I think the ask itself should never be automated.
Great.
I don't think the thank you should ever be automated. I think automating anything tied to really important personal emotions should not be automated. A message sent around grief, a message sent around a personal or, societal crisis, major life transitions, any moments where the donor needs to feel really seen by a specific person is important. There are times you just don't want a donor to feel that they are just being processed by a system. And I think the only way that can really happen is, again, always having a human make the final decision, not just the edit, but the actual decision. I think what's funny enough is that those moments that I'm talking about that should never be automated are oftentimes tied to the lifetime donor value, that an organization receives. So I think it's one of those questions that is different for different nonprofits, not necessarily, whether it be higher ed or the arts or social justice. I think it's particular, I think it varies, and I think it's unique. I personally think, though, that the ask itself, I don't think that should be automated in a major gift scenario.
Mhm.
I'm not talking about a major gift, a campaign where you're just sending an ask out via email using AI.
Like an
But
annual giving
yeah, Manuel, I
initiative.
don't think that's the case. But if, how would you feel if you found out a virtual engagement officer that you thought was a human just asked you to endow $1 million scholarship in your daughter's name that passed away? You would not feel good,
Right.
whether somebody says you opted in or not. Don't get me started on the statistics of opting in. But, I do think there are some things that should never be automated. Whether that will stay in existence as AI transforms and advances remains to be seen. But I do think right now the question is different for everybody, but I do think it's important for nonprofits and individuals in nonprofits to identify what they personally feel should never be automated.
Yeah, that's a great response. Um, so let's jump into a bit of governance conversation with a couple of questions. And one of them is, what does responsible AI governance look like for a small nonprofit with limited resources?
I think in that sense, it's not super technical. The board doesn't need to understand the algorithms that are happening. That's not really necessary, but it does need to know that the organization has a process for deciding what gets adopted, how things are reviewed. I think that oversight is important for any small nonprofit. And that is, it can be done outside of whatever financial controls exist. Um, some of the smallest nonprofits we know still have even three, four people on their board. Just making sure that they have an idea and a general oversight, I think, is something to strive for and not something that is completely out of reach and not something that small nonprofits should just say, oh, we're too small. We don't have to worry about that. I think that is very dangerous,
Mhm.
especially for a small nonprofit that is trying to grow.
And so the board does have some responsibility and ownership over the sort of AI use and policy and framework as well.
I think so because I think it's just as important as the other critical parts of an organization that the board has oversight on. It shouldn't be looked at as something less important than, you know, financial decisions that are being made by whoever it is in the organization. I think it's just as important. I think it's a critical part now as we advance. I think AI is going to be so critical to the advancement and increasing capacity for a nonprofit organization that's maybe smaller. I think it's even more important sometimes for a board to have oversight into the decisions that are being made.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So, a closing question for our nonprofit CEOs out there that are listening to today's conversation. If they're going to only take one action after hearing this podcast, what should it be and why?
Go into your organization, find out where AI is already being used, and don't approve it or ban it. Neither of those two. Just find out where it's being used. You can't govern what you don't know exists. I think that is the one thing to take away. This is happening. I know it is still really hard for a lot of people to accept, but if you do not even acknowledge or admit to yourself through asking questions that it is already happening in your organization, you are going to end up pushed into a corner where you're going to have to make some very reactive decisions as opposed to proactive.
Beautiful. Well, Tara, thank you for sharing your insights and helping us
Yeah,
navigate a topic that's becoming increasingly important for nonprofit leaders.
sure. I'm
One of
happy to
my,
offer my insight. I'm happy to.
yeah, well, and people should definitely be reaching out to the Quarry Development Group. What's the best way for them to find you on your website?
Yeah, quarrydevelopmentgroup.com. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. If you want to send me a personal email, I answer almost every single one. It's Tara, Tara, at quarrydevelopmentgroup.com. Ask me any question you have about creating your governance policy. I think that's the best step first is to identify where you are in your adoption process of AI. And that's the first step that I take with a lot of organizations, just to get them in the mind of thinking, okay, what step do we take from here? I think that's where I enjoy helping people the most in this sector and where we are is just helping organizations say, okay, I've started, I've taken the first step. I think that's what we do really, really well at QDG.
Yeah, yeah, don't you? That is for sure. And I encourage everyone out there to make the connection with Tara. You won't be disappointed. But one of my biggest takeaways from today's conversation is that AI isn't just primarily a tech issue. It's a leadership issue, it's a governance issue, and it's a trust issue. And so I know the organizations that will benefit from AI won't necessarily be the ones that move the fastest. They're going to be the ones that move thoughtfully, ask the right questions, and remain committed to preserving the trust that donors place in them every day. So to you, Tara, thank you for joining us. And to our listeners, thank you for joining another episode of the Nonprofit Edge. If you found today's conversation valuable, please share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, keep leading with purpose, with curiosity and impact, and keep leading for good. Thanks all.
Thank you for joining us for the Nonprofit Edge, a podcast series to promote purpose in practice. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation and learned some important lessons from our featured expert. We always want our content to be informative and to position nonprofit leaders to succeed. Please join us again for our next podcast. In the meantime, we wish you all the best and encourage you to learn more about Fulcrum nonprofit leadership by visiting our website at www.fulcrumleader.com.
Yeah.